Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Ed Collab Gathering Fall session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dana Stachowiak today, who's going to be talking about diversity and social justice in the classroom. Do remember to use the hashtag #TheEdCollabGathering, hashtag 9 to tweet and join in the conversation with us. Over to you, Dana.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Either you're joining me with coffee or you're joining me with rum. I don't know. Either way, hopefully you're ready to have a good time. Let me pull up the slide really quickly instead of sharing my face this whole time. So the title of this is Moving from Diversity to Social Justice, Thinking Critically About Literacy Pedagogy. Oops. Hold on. Okay, so I'm back. So I'll introduce myself really quickly if you haven't seen me before. Again, I'm Dana Stachowiak. I am a literacy consultant with the Educator Collaborative, and I travel the country working with schools and administrators and teams of teachers to bring literacy alive in their classrooms. But I'm mostly interested in literacy as it has to do with social justice and diversity. So that's the two topics that I'm most interested in, social justice and equity, are going to be what we're talking about today. But I also wanted to put in a little plug here about our virtual think tanks. So we have cohorts, and I do a few of them, some with new coaches, but also some for advanced coaches. And one of the cohorts that I'm doing this year is actually an extension or more in-depth study of what you're going to be learning about today with me. So if any of this interests you today and you want to learn a little bit more about it, I encourage you to check out this cohort. It's called Multicultural Literacy, an Intensive Study of Ourselves, Our Classrooms, and Our Opportunities. And it spans grades K through 12, like today's session. So I encourage you to look into that. And if not this cohort, then other cohorts. I work with some really amazing peers that are putting on cohorts as well. So I just wanted to put in that little plug there. So welcome again. Some of you might be joining me in your PJs, and don't be fooled. I am not wearing any shoes during my session. I wanted to go ahead and remind you again to live tweet along with this session. If you can include my Twitter handle at Dr. Stachowiak, that would be great. If not, just hashtag the Ed Collab Gathering space and then hashtag 9. You can also email me at dmstachowiak@gmail.com if you have any questions about this that maybe couldn't fit on the however many characters that Twitter allows. If you want to continue this conversation with me, or even if you just want to say hello, I welcome emails. So I just want to move right along and start out with just giving you a list of the goals for today, just so you kind of know what to expect. So the very first goal for today is I want to help you recognize the difference between diversity and social justice. So during this part of the presentation, I'm going to spend a little bit of time having you think about these terms, and then we'll kind of do a compare and contrast of the two. The next goal is that I want to help you learn about the key tenets of equity, literacy, and social justice education. And these two, equity, literacy, and social justice education, they really form the backbone of thinking critically about our literacy pedagogy in this moving from diversity to social justice. And finally, I want to spend some time helping you understand how to use close reading with social justice in mind. So after we understand what it means to move from diversity to social justice, then what could that look like in the classroom? So those are just our 3 short but big goals today. So I want to jump right in and say, I want to have us start thinking about diversity and what it means. So I want you to pull out a scrap piece of paper, or if you're taking notes, go ahead and put this in your notes, wherever. But on your paper, I want you to write as many words that come to your mind when you think of diversity. So I'm going to give you maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds, whatever that looks like in my head. I'd put on background music, but I don't think Google will let us do that, and I'm definitely not going to hum or sing. But anyway, go ahead and take a few seconds to put down a list of words of what you think of when you hear diversity. Okay, so that maybe was 30 seconds or something, but hopefully you got some words down. So when I'm not educator collaborating, I am an assistant professor of diversity and multicultural education, where I teach courses on equity and social justice in education with literacy and other things. But I ask this question at the beginning of every semester to my education students, but I also ask this question of educators like yourselves from across the country. And you can probably imagine the range of words I've seen, which is many, but the three most common are difference, multicultural, and equality. So those three words, maybe you had them or maybe you didn't. It's no right or wrong, but these are the three that are most common that I've seen for a number of years that come up: difference, multicultural, and equality. And I also want you to take a look at the pictures on the screen as well. These images or images similar are what I see on a lot of school walls all over the country, especially on displays about celebrating diversity. There's always some sort of obligatory multiracial hand-holding photo, as well as some oversimplified cartoony pictures or drawings of some sort of simplified diversity. And then there might be some inspirational quote about working together or diversity that goes along with it. Now, this isn't to say that these words, these pictures, the dialogue that this creates about diversity, that these aren't important or that they should be stopped in the classrooms or in schools. They are important. And we should see and hear some of this stuff in schools. But today we're going to talk about how we can maybe talk about these with a little bit more depth and less surface level. So let's start by talking about, so now we've got this idea of what diversity might mean to us. So let's talk about what diversity and social justice are, and maybe a little bit of what they aren't. So think back to those three top words: difference, multicultural, and equality. When people talk about diversity, they not only talk about it in respect to appreciating and celebrating diversity, but they often equate the celebration of diversity to social justice work or to human rights work. Now, diversity and social justice are not the same, but they are related. So it's helpful here to remember that diversity is a part of social justice, but diversity is not equal to social justice. So you might be thinking right now, okay, Dana, then what is the difference between diversity and social justice? They're not the same, but diversity is a part of social justice. I might be a little confused. So you might be asking that question. And I also want to remind you now, if you're asking that question or others, please don't forget. Let me see if I can figure this out, if it comes up. Oh, I used to have a thing down there that said my name, but it's gone away. But anyway, when you go ahead, if you have any questions, if you want to tweet to hashtag the Ed Collab Gathering space and then #9, you can go ahead and ask any more questions that you have. So just as a reminder, go ahead and screen share again. That's gone. I don't know why that went away. I'm not very tech savvy. Anyway, so you're thinking, what is the difference then between diversity and social justice? So let's talk about that difference. When we talk about diversity, the outcome is usually one where we recognize difference. And we recognize that there's a difference between people. So these differences are usually ones that we can see: a person's gender, a person's race or eye color. And if we're lucky, we might be encouraged to think about the less visible differences, such as cultural values or traditions. With social justice, on the other hand, we don't just recognize the differences, we recognize the diversity among students. So social justice doesn't just focus on the fact that there are differences, it focuses on the diversity of those differences. Let's go back over to diversity. When we think about diversity, we often stop at just making sure that we raise an awareness to the needs of our diverse body of students. So as literacy teachers, this often looks like us thinking, okay, well, I have students with differences in my classroom, so I better make sure that I have these differences represented in text, in the text that I use. And while some of you probably do more than just have those books on hand or just read from them, the notion of diversity alone actually doesn't call us to do anything more than raise an awareness. So if we wanted to stop right here with diversity, that's all it calls us to do, is just raise an awareness of these differences. Social justice, on the other hand, does all of these things that you see on the right. So it calls us to challenge, confront, and disrupt misconceptions, untruths, or stereotypes. It calls us to promote critical thinking and support agency for social change. And it calls us to recognize the needs for these students to find relevant connections among themselves, their peers, the subject matter, and the tasks the teacher has asked them to perform. Right here, it's important to stop and remember that social justice is both a process and a goal. And so this means that there's more to the process than bringing in awareness. As you can see, there's all of these steps. There's more to the process than just bringing in awareness to diversity. So let me stop here really quickly and say, if this sounds familiar, this stuff about social justice and about challenging misconceptions and promoting critical thinking and meeting students where they're at, this should sound familiar. If you remember, if you joined the Educator Collaborative for our gathering in the spring, I, along with Sylvia and Jeanette, Sylvia being my lovely smart wife, and Jeanette being our really good friend and colleague, we all worked together to talk to you about culturally responsive literacy practices. So if you haven't seen that session, it's archived, and I recommend that you check it out as an extension to what I'm talking about today. Not necessarily, I'm not necessarily saying you have to have seen that in order to understand what I'm talking about today. This is just an extension to it. So in that session, we shared what it means to be culturally responsive, as well as how we embody that in our classrooms. And then we also talked to you about how to choose culturally responsive text. So when we talk about diversity and social justice, we necessarily are talking about being culturally responsive. So yes, this should sound familiar if you've learned about it either in the session with myself, Sylvia, and Jeanette, or if you just learned about culturally responsive teaching altogether. So let me quickly recap so you can just see how these are interrelated. I'm not going to go through this graphic, but I just wanted to make you aware of it. So one of the things that we talked about, or that we spent some time talking about, was sort of this evolution and how educators have thought about diversity in our literacy practices. So we had the old school, multicultural, and then we moved to culturally responsive. And what I want you to pay particular attention to right now is this culturally responsive part, and especially to the component on the bottom right here, supporting equity and social justice. Being culturally responsive means supporting equity and social justice. So as you can see, incorporating social justice into your literacy pedagogy is being culturally responsive, like I said. So if you look to the column to the left over here under multicultural, it says celebrating diversity. And this is oftentimes where people get stuck. What I see in classrooms across the country is that teachers are working really, really hard on being culturally responsive. They have great student-teacher partnerships happening. They're using multiple texts. They are using texts that reflect real social issues and so forth. But folks are usually still just over in this column of celebrating diversity, not really digging deeper down into supporting social justice as we should be if we're being culturally responsive. And so this is where people often give up on believing that culturally responsive teaching creates richer readers and writers, because they can't see how this outcome is any different than using multicultural teaching methods. Not because there isn't a difference, there is a difference, but because they are missing that key component over here of supporting equity and social justice. And again, this isn't the fault of the teacher. It's usually because, as we saw earlier when I asked you to define these things, that we don't know the difference between celebrating diversity and supporting social justice, because we've mostly seen them as one and the same when they're not. So moving right along. So Paul Gorski and Katie Swalwell wrote an amazingly beautiful article on equity literacy. It's called Equity Literacy for All, and I think it just came out in ASCD. I think it's ASCD in March of 2015. Check it out, read it. It's really, really solid work. And so I want to use equity literacy in the way that they do to kind of set the framework for social justice in our literacy pedagogy. So according to Paul and Katie, the idea here is to move from placing an emphasis on culture to placing an emphasis on equity at the center of our diversity conversation. So remember, diversity and social justice and all of that, they all go together. They're all interrelated. But what happens when we focus on culture, we tend to fall into the trap of focusing on differences, but not how we are impacted socially by those differences. When we talk about equity issues, we focus on how when we're over here talking about equity issues, we focus on how we and others are impacted socially, and that's important. So for example, if we start to talk to our students about we might talk to our students about the difference between Islam and Christianity when we focus on the culture side of things. But when we focus on equity issues, we start to talk to our students about the differences and about how some people are treated unfairly or how some people are more privileged based on their religious belief, hands down. So there's an idea of the difference of having our culture conversations and having our equity conversations. So I also want to stop here and say that it's important to note that equity and equality are not the same thing. I'm going to say that again. Equity and equality are not the same thing. Yep, they're related, but they're not the same thing. So equity makes certain that individual needs are met based on individuals' differences. Equality makes sure that everyone is treated the same regardless of their differences. So when we talk about the cultural aspects and differences, we talk about how people aren't treated the same or equal. When we shift our conversation to equity, we begin to talk about how we might treat people in different ways that ensure that they're treated fairly. So cultural conversations, in essence, focus on deficit, and equity conversations focus on asset. And when we focus on this asset, that gives these equity conversations the potential to create change, to create real social change. And that creation of that real social change is at the heart of social justice work, which is at the heart of what we're talking about today. So in equity literacy, oops, I clicked a little early. In equity literacy, Paul and Katie remind us that we need to recognize even subtle forms of bias, discrimination, and inequity. We need to respond to all of those things in thoughtful and equitable ways. We need to redress these biases, discrimination, and inequities, not only by responding to our interpersonal bias, but also to studying the ways in which bigger social change happens. So what else is happening in that world? So us and others and the interplay. And then also we need to cultivate and sustain bias-free and discrimination-free communities. So I want to talk with you really quickly about these. I'll leave those on the screen for just a second, but I want to, did I stop my screen share? I think I stopped my screen share. Okay, so I want to talk to you about that. So all of these things that Paul and Katie have listed, it's a really, really hard work. And it is stuff that you are going to be doing for the rest of your life. It's stuff that you're going to be always working on, continuing to recognize, respond to, redress, cultivate, and sustain. You're just going to continuously do this. And there's not enough time in this session or in anything virtual to get that work done. It's ongoing. So what I encourage you to do is, so today's session isn't about how we do this part of it, but it's a really important part of it. So I want to make you aware of it. And I encourage you to talk to your administrators about either bringing professional development, which it needs to be really strong, solid professional development. Even Katie and Paul talk about that in their article, is that you need to have really strong, good professional development in these areas. So talk to them about bringing that into your school, or about you going to workshops that support this kind of work. And as a shameless plug here, I'm going to say that if you would like to have somebody come facilitate for you, I can do that. Again, this is the work that I most love to do, and this is really important work, and it's not stuff that we can just skip over. It's stuff that we really need to focus on. So I just wanted to put that out there. So I'm going to go back to screen share. Again, this is going to be archived, so you can come back to these. So I want to talk now about, we understand equity literacy. So what do our literacy classrooms need to look like now that they're focused, once we shift our focus to social justice? So Sonia Nieto and Patty Bode, they lay out 4 components for social justice in education that are really similar to equity literacy. I'm just going to put those on the screen. And they should be similar, right? Because equity literacy and then social justice education are interrelated with one another, along with diversity, culturally responsive, all of that. They build upon each other and are interrelated. But Nieto and Bode also insist that social justice education must draw on the talents and strengths that students bring to their education. And the key here is that a social justice classroom promotes critical thinking and supports agency for social change. This last one is most important because thinking in terms of social justice involves action. And the action, and here I'm talking about the action of doing something really meaningful with your work as a reader and writer. So I'm going to spend the rest of the remainder of the session giving you just a glimpse of how you can incorporate social justice pedagogy into your literacy classrooms. So I am going to turn to close reading with social justice in mind. So a really important pedagogical strategy that is just supportive altogether, but especially supportive of social justice literacy is this practice of close reading. So our lovely founder, Chris, who's my idol and my mentor, along with Kate Roberts, wrote this really amazing book, Falling in Love with Close Reading. If you haven't read it, shame on you. Go get it, read it, do a book study, love it, wear it out, and buy another copy. But the two of these brilliant folks pull together several important and overlapping definitions that they use to share their vision for effective close reading in their book. So in short, they assert that students engage in multiple close reads by critically analyzing texts while also valuing their lives and experiences. Keywords here are engage, multiple, critical, and clearly what drives close reading is directly in line with critical social justice work in literacy because of the necessity of critical engagement right here with the word and the world. Students must close read while also valuing their lives and experiences. That is so important. So Kate and Chris in their book, they outline 3 essential steps for close reading. First one is reading through lenses, using lenses to find patterns, and using patterns to develop new understandings. So I'm not going to spend time talking about what they talk about in their fabulous book, but I am going to talk about how we incorporate that with social justice. So their book will be really beneficial into understanding what I'm talking about today, but hopefully what I propose to you today you can kind of get the gist on your own. Actually, I think you will be able to get the gist on your own. So I'm going to walk you through what it might look like if we close read with social justice in mind. So let's start with the first step, which is to read through lenses. So Chris and Kate name these lenses as text evidence, word choice, structure, and point of view and argument. And so let me stop here and say that I highly recommend that your students are familiar with these steps of close reading before embarking on close reading with social justice in mind. And the reason being is that when teaching with social justice in mind, students need to know how to read through an anti-oppression lens, okay? In addition to all of these different lenses. So just quickly, an anti-oppression lens is one by which students read with a critical consciousness of equity and social justice. So students will also need to be familiar with equity and social justice. So asking students to learn about text evidence, social justice, equity, all of those together as they read through an anti-oppression lens will be just too big of a task to tackle at once. So if students are well versed with how to do close reading first, as suggested by Chris and Kate, it's going to be a little bit easier for them to overlay this anti-oppression lens. So when reading through our anti-oppression lens, there are 2 important questions that students should ask during this part of the close read. And the first one is, what is the knowledge claim that the author is trying to make in this text? And the second one is, who benefits from or who is limited by this knowledge claim? So to make this a little bit more clear, let's look at an example to just help you grasp what this might look like in the classroom. So when students are analyzing word choice, for example, so let's use that lens. So when they're analyzing word choice, they need to specifically hone in on the analysis through a social justice lens with those 2 questions in mind. So keep those questions in mind. I'm going to repeat them in a second, but let's use the book, A Nappy Hair. I've used this one before. I like to use it a lot. It's kind of an easy one to pick on, but and gives a good example. But the story is about, if you haven't read it, it's about a young Black girl and how her hair came to be the way it is. So in one part of the story, if I'm analyzing the words, the author writes, did I click it here? Why you gotta be so ornery, thinking about giving that nappy hair to that innocent little child. So let's think about that first question. What is the knowledge claim the author is trying to make? So here, the knowledge claim appears to be that nappy hair is the result of someone being ornery. So if we do a critical analysis of the word ornery, used in conjunction with nappy hair, we can assess that this pairing sends a message that nappy hair is not a good thing to possess. And then that second question asks us to think about who this knowledge claim benefits or who it limits. And so when we think about this through a social justice lens, it exposes that it actually limits student understanding that one type of hair is more acceptable than another type of hair. And in this case, the author is stating with this word choice that rough nappy hair is not as acceptable as smooth soft hair, or she's asserting that. And when we think about who this limits, then it is safe to say that our African American students who maybe see themselves in this main character with nappy hair, they might walk away thinking that their hair is not as good as smooth soft hair. And then on the flip side, students with smooth soft hair benefit from this knowledge claim because it asserts that their hair is better than their African American peers. So I want to stop here and talk to you really quickly. One of the questions that I get is, okay, Dana, this is an example of poor word choice. In this case, should we use good word choice? Should we use some examples of really strong word choice? And the answer, of course, is yes. In a perfect world, I would actually have you use some maybe non-examples in some examples, but I know that that isn't always the case. But in a perfect world, let me pull this up really quickly. In a perfect world, I might have you, I often pull, when I'm talking about nappy hair, I often pull the book I Love My Hair by Natasha Tarpley. So I love this story, I Love My Hair. It's about a young Black girl and the love and labor that goes into her hair. And first, the title alone tells you it's putting a positive spin on the topic, but I encourage you to look up this book because I really love the empowering language used in this text. This girl is just really empowered by her hair, even though it can be a labor. It's a labor of love. And again, if I have both books, I would have students analyze for word choice, and then you can have really critical conversations about the implication of the language used in these books. On the other hand, if it's not the perfect world and we don't have nappy hair and we don't have I Love My Hair, let's say we just have nappy hair, you can still have really critical conversations. For example, if you just have nappy hair, you might ask your students to think about how they might change some of the words in the book to make it less limiting and make it more empowering. So that's a really critical conversation you can have. Moving on to the next step, which is outlined again by Chris and Kate, which is to use lenses to find patterns. Now, these patterns are going to vary, but when students are reading through an anti-oppression lens, you got to remember that they need to focus on the issues of equity in regards to race, sex, gender identity, class, sexuality, ability, and religion, and there's more. And then also as well as the intersections of these. Now, when I say consider the intersections of these equity issues, I simply mean not to look at them in isolation. So you're going to notice that on the left here, I put the kind of the social construct, and then over here on the right, I put the oppression related to each issue. And it's really, really important when you're doing social justice work and literacy that you use both when talking through these about these issues. So, and the reason, let me explain this really quickly if I can. Equity issues of race are racism, but if you think about it, when one person has a different skin color from another, that's race diversity. That's diversity. When a person is treated unfairly as a result of their race, that's racism. And talking about racism is part of social justice work. That's what makes this work different from just diversity. In diversity, we're going to talk about the race differences. In social justice work, we're actually going to talk about the issues of systemic racism. Similarly, equity issues with sex are sexism. So when a person is male and one person is female, that's sex diversity, and we talk about that a lot. But when a person is treated unfairly because as a result of their sex, that's sexism. And it's important to make that distinction and not shy away from using the correct terminology, even if it feels uncomfortable. And these things are going to feel uncomfortable at first because we don't talk about them. We're told not to, right? We stay here in this diversity side because it's safe. Social justice work asks us to move out here. But the bottom line is no one said that social justice work was easy. So just keep that in mind. It's not easy, but it's so important and so valuable. Anyway, so off of that a little bit, off my soapbox there, just please remember that importance when talking about, when looking at things through an anti-oppression lens. So I want to go and next talk about how we find patterns. Let me give you some examples of how we might find patterns. So I'm going to use the book, this book about Malala Yousafzai, I think I'm saying that right. The young Pakistani girl, I'm sure you have heard about her, who advocated for education for women or for all children, and then was targeted and shot by a gunman as she sat in her school bus, but she still has championed education for women in her country. So when reading this book with social justice in mind, we could choose to analyze the ways in which Malala is portrayed related to issues of her sex as female. That is, not just looking at through the diversity lens, but through the anti-oppression lens, which we would need to find patterns of sexism, if there are any. But at the same time, it's also important to analyze how the Islamic faith is portrayed related to issues of religion. So within that, we need to find patterns of religious oppression, if there are any, in the book. It's also important to, like I said before, to recognize those intersections. So we need to read and analyze the ways in which Malala is portrayed as an Islamic girl. So reading and analyzing the portrayal of her sex and her religion as they intersect. And I just realized how funny that kind of looks up there in the corner, sex and religion. So if you didn't know what I was talking about, you might think this was an entirely different conversation. But anyway, the questions that students should ask as they read for patterns will largely depend on the issues in the text, but they should build on those two questions that the students had asked before as they read through the anti-oppression lens. So there are two basic questions that I encourage you to have your readers begin asking as they read for patterns. Two of them. The first one, who or what does this author's knowledge claim give power to? If you remember, the last question is, what knowledge does this author claim? Now we're asking, okay, based on the knowledge claim, who is the power given to? And second, what stereotypes, biases, and myths are challenged or upheld? So when thinking about sexism in this text, I might pull out a list of words or phrases. I might look at word choice related to how the author describes Malala as a girl. I might assess the knowledge claim of the author and then decide if these words empower or diminish her as a girl. So if these words are empowering, what stereotypes about girls, if any, are challenged, and have critical conversations about that and the implications of that. And then if the words are diminishing, then what stereotypes about girls are upheld, and then again, the implications of that. So moving on to the last step, as students begin to find these patterns as they do their close reading, then they ask critically conscious questions in order to develop a new understanding of, in not only the text, as Kate and Chris have said, but also the larger systems of the world. And when you're thinking about social justice, they're also reading, looking into the larger systems of oppression that are at play in the text and the world. So in their book, For a Better World, Reading and Writing for Social Action, if you don't have this book, again, if you're interested in social justice work, this is a really great text to use as a resource. Has some really great ideas. I ground a lot of the work that I do with schools in off of some of the stuff that comes out of this book. So I highly recommend this book if you're looking for a book study on social justice. But anyway, the authors present readers with a really substantial list of questions for critical reading that are helpful to close reading with social justice in mind. But I want to highlight three that are really particularly useful at this point of close reading when students are developing a new understanding. So the first one is, at what points do you notice yourself resisting the book, the characters, or the author? So for this, I might think about how when I first read, Nappy Hair, and when I first started to feel uneasy about the book, what part of the book did that start for me, and maybe thinking about why or the implications of that. The second question, what does your resistance say about the book, and what does it say about you? So here, I'm not working only to assess the issues within the book or the biases that the author might hold, but I'm also really working to assess my own biases. So Paul and Katie talked about this being important. Nieto and Bode talked about this being really important. So we not only need to think about the author, but we also need to think about ourselves and our reactions to that, and what that might say about us and the ways that we read the word and the world. And the third question, how does this book help you think about social issues you care about or causes you are committed to? So this is where the action, I mean, this is all action, but this is also thinking about action in the real life sense. So when thinking about the Nappy Hair book again, as well as my own commitment that I have to anti-racist education and training, I might start to think about how maybe this is not the best book to advocate for in literacy classrooms. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't teach using this book, but I shouldn't advocate for it without having a critical conversation about the implications of some of the messages that are in the books or in the book, or how we might work with our students to have them pull out what are some of the issues within the book. So the purpose of these three questions then is to encourage critical thinking about the word and the world. Okay, the word and the world. That's so important here. That's based on the work of Paulo Freire, if you're interested. The purpose of these three questions is to foster dialogue on equity and social change. And this dialogue on equity and social change, this is a central component, I've said it a million times, of social justice work in literacy. So I just want to, I'm actually at the end of this. We've got a little bit of time, which is good, but I want to just recap. Let me stop screen sharing here, and I think I'm back on. And I'm going to recap, and I'm going to look down on my notes because I'm not savvy like that right now. But I want to quickly recap before I end this session. So first, I want you to walk away remembering that culturally responsive pedagogy, diversity, equity, literacy, and social justice are all intertwined, and they work together. We can't just focus on one or the other. We have to focus on all of them, with some of them holding a little bit more weight than the others, as we've talked about today. The other thing I want you to think about is when students close read, they engage in multiple close reads by critically analyzing text while also valuing their lives and experiences. It's really, really important. Words by Kate and Chris about that really hones in on how we do our work with social justice, how we move from diversity to social justice work. And finally, close reading with social justice in mind requires a reading with an anti-oppression lens. So we're going to do all of this work, we're going to think about all of these things, but it's not going to be particularly helpful if we don't do this through an anti-oppression lens. So that's again where I was talking about, don't just focus on the diversity, don't just focus on race or gender, but focus on the oppression that goes along with that and have that conversation. So let me do a screen share again, and let me very quickly just thank you for joining me. I think I've got a few things coming up. If anybody has any tweets that maybe Carolyn can put forth, I don't know if we have any of those. If we don't, that's okay. We can end early and you all can have a little bit longer of a break. But I did want to thank you for joining me. Again, if you want to tweet me any questions or comments or anything now, you can go ahead and do that right there at Dr. Stachowiak, hashtag the Ed Collab Gathering, a space, #9, or also you can email me if you have any burning questions or you want to have any continuing conversations. So I'll stop sharing there. I'm seeing a couple tweets come through that are just comments, which are really awesome. I'm glad people are participating that way. Again, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and email or tweet them to me. Oh, I'm seeing one come up. What is the best way for teachers to examine their own biases? Ooh, that's a really good question. So what's the best way to do that? I don't know, there are 1,001 best ways to do that. And again, kind of like I said earlier, there's not really time for that to talk about, but I really do encourage people to start looking at themselves and looking at the ways in which they are either part of the dominant group or if they are a part of the subordinate group. So if they're privileged or they're oppressed in this society. So taking a look at your social constructs, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religious beliefs, all of those things, and really start thinking about what are the impacts that those social constructs have on you, but also how do they impact the rest of the world. And once you start thinking about that impact, you can start thinking about your biases that you might start to hold. Again, I really do recommend that you have really solid professional development in this arena. This is ongoing. It's not, a lot of times we see diversity trainings that happen with one session and then you're done and then you're left going, oh, okay, I know what diversity means, but really they should be kind of focusing on a social justice mindset. So if you are looking for ways in which you can start to notice your own biases and start to assess the impact that you have on others and how they impact you in ways related to social justice and equity issues, you really should have good, solid training on how to think about that. I think that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Carolyn to close up the session, because we whipped right through that and I don't think I see anything else coming up. So Carolyn, do you want to end that?
Well, thank you, Dana. I think we all learned a lot about the differences between diversity and social justice. And one of the things that we'll definitely be doing is examining our own. Thank you for that insight. Thank you for bringing helping us make the connection between diversity and close reading, something that we all can do in the classroom. In a world today where diversity is so much a part of our lives, I think this is a very insightful presentation, and I hope schools do take the initiative to bring people like you to the classroom for training. All right. Just before we go, I'd like to, for those of you who are still with us, I'd like to just remind you about the upcoming presentations that are coming up in session 3. So what we do have in session 3 is we do have some wonderful presentations. We have workshop number 11 presented by Chad Everett and his team. They're going to be talking about having authentic conversations about race and diversity. Again, a good follow-up to this session. Workshop number 12, Emily Kirkpatrick will be talking about family engagement and literacy. In workshop number 13, Brian Sweeney and Ryan Dunbar will be talking to us about life beyond the group work drama, tech tips for collaborating, writing in the secondary classroom. And workshop number 14 is Elisa Eekholt and Denise Schweikart talking to us about every child being a mentor. Just a reminder to all of you today that this day is brought to you by the EdCollab Gathering, and it's completely free. If you would like to contribute, make a small contribution to one of our charities, it's the Book Love Foundation. You can definitely Google that and make a small contribution to help out there. Also, you can continue to join us at theedcollaborative.com, where you can view the rest of the videos for today. Or if you want to see one but you missed it, you can join us on YouTube later, youtube.com/theedcollabgathering. Do continue to tweet and join the conversation using the hashtag #theedcollabgathering, and then add the hashtag of the workshop that you are watching. All right. Once again, thanks for joining us, and I hope you can continue on into the next presentation. Thanks, Dana.
Thanks, Carolyn.